The next panel, pharma, big pharma and the information economy. Drug companies. We didn't have a pharma track last year, and we thought that it was an important, a significant omission. Drug companies have long been among the most sophisticated and advanced users of IT, both in data and analytics, as well as sort of workflow and process automation. My prior firm was a first-round investor in Dendrite, which is one of the earliest CRMs aimed at an industry vertical. After Dendrite, Siebel made major inroads into the pharma vertical with their sales automation tool, and I suspect Salesforce.com has largely replaced Siebel today, and we can ask Josh Newman about that when he's on a panel later this afternoon. Meanwhile, pharma on the manufacturing side has always been a big adopter of ERP and MRP systems, and we all know about clinical trials management tools, first on client server and then on the web. I remember visiting Pfizer headquarters here in New York as far back, I think it was 1994, as part of diligence for an intelligent firewall network security company called Raptor Systems I was working on at the time. And Pfizer engineers were using this thing called the internet to chat with their colleagues and compatriots in other countries around the world. Pharma, sort of the first visibility I got into Usenet and listservs. Pharma R&D, meanwhile, is a heavy user of analytics for compound screening and other research functions. Finally, pharma has always been a huge purchaser of data and analytics from both data oligopolists like IMS, but also dozens of other specialized sources and vendors. I think Barbara Dalton at Pfizer told me that they have 60 different, does that sound right, 60 information technology vendors across the company. No. So today, like everyone else in healthcare, pharma is confronting new business challenges ranging from cost control to generics competition to an increasingly complex supply chain courtesy of PBMs, et cetera. Here to discuss some of the niches of interest to the IT investor in the pharma sector, we have the president and founder of Medidata, founder of Veeva, and a consultant to the pharma industry. So Glen and team.
Wendy, someone who actually works in the pharma industry.
And sorry. Wendy, sorry.
You guys go.
My notes predated your acceptance. We're happy you're here.
Great, thank you.
All right. So since we took you away from your networking and we stand between you and lunch, we're going to try to change up the energy a little bit. So I'm going to introduce the session. I'll sit with everybody. We're going to ask the other panelists to stand up and introduce themselves, and then we'll try to have a conversation with you guys. I think it's kind of interesting that just by means of introduction, the only time life sciences or pharma really got mentioned so far today is that everybody hates us. I think you know the phrase, a poor craftsman blames his tools. But if you're going to ask me to build a house, I probably want the right tools to do it. And that is what we, as the life sciences industry, and I think that's what we're here as suppliers of services to life sciences, as life sciences, but that's what we're here to represent. I think if you look at the levers that come out of life sciences on a lot of the conversations that happen today, healthcare costs, value, the relationships between patients and providers and payers and pharmacists, which I thought was interesting. Maybe we'll get into that a little bit today. We really stand at a place, or sit at a place, where we can have a dramatic effect on that kind of whirling world of healthcare. And I guess the question that we'll get to in a few minutes is, are we doing as good enough a job of doing that as we should be, or as we can be, and is there room for technology to make that better? So with that, I'll hand it over to Matt, and he can introduce himself, and we'll go down the row.
All right. Good morning, everyone. My name is Matt Wallach. I'm one of the founders from Veeva Systems. I'd like to thank Brandon for already introducing me. You gave kind of the history of the pharma Salesforce automation business. That's sort of my history. I ran the pharma division at Siebel that kind of took out Dendrite, and now Veeva is the company that you referred to. You said Salesforce.com is taking over from Siebel. That's true, but they're doing it with Veeva. Veeva is actually Salesforce.com's largest OEM partner, and we're kind of their pharma vertical, for lack of a better way to refer to it. So that's my history, is basically automating salespeople. About 80% of the sales reps in the U.S. use the software that my teams build, either at Siebel or at Veeva. So that's been my thing for about 15 years. For this panel, my perspective is that I saw this from a client-server perspective for 5-6 years at Siebel, and now I've seen it from a cloud computing perspective and at Veeva. And so that perspective, I think, is valuable if you're looking at investing at companies or what's going to happen next. Because Veeva, we kind of think of ourselves as trying to be one of the delivery mechanisms for cloud computing into the life sciences industry. So we're kind of picking off areas where there's a big installed base of an old, kind of clunky client-server type system. Siebel was one, Documentum is another, big custom data warehouses is kind of the next one. And we think that the cloud and that type of approach can have a big impact on life sciences companies.
Well, great. Good morning. My name is Geoff Schmidt. I'm a partner with Accenture in our life sciences practice. Been in that practice for about 16 years, where we serve, what we call life sciences, which is sort of big, top 40-ish pharma, emerging biotech, CROs, medical device companies, as well as partnering and sometimes consulting to software companies that are aiming to serve that industry. These days, and over the past 3 or 4 years, I guess, I've run our global R&D technology practice. So the point of view I'm going to hope to try to share today is from meeting with heads of R&D IT from the top 20 pharmas, from CROs, from emerging biotechs, et cetera, consulting with them, working as an advocate for them, sometimes a psychologist to them, as they struggle with the idea that they're probably spending 80 or 90% of their time keeping the lights on or doing things called innovation that are really just the next generation of existing capabilities, when they'd rather be spending 80 or 90% of their time, energy, and passion driving new capabilities and harnessing the power of all that data and helping their business customers be able to discover and develop drugs faster, cheaper, better, et cetera.
Good morning. My name is Wendy Mayer, and I am the Vice President of Innovation for Pfizer, and I apologize ahead of time for the squeaky voice. I've been at Pfizer for about 15 years. Most of my time at Pfizer is spent in market analytics capacity, providing data and insights and strategic recommendations to our business. As a leader of the innovation group at Pfizer spans the scope of our businesses globally, and we're focused in 3 predominant areas. One is to drive and incubate innovative platforms across our business. So there are areas of innovation that we feel have relevance and importance to many sectors of our business, but because they cross, they can have difficulty having owners that can really drive them for the scalability and applicability across the business. The second area is to accelerate and support the innovation activities across our businesses. So providing innovation process and providing means for the development of an innovative culture across our businesses that really enable the acceptance of change and acceptance of innovative ideas across the enterprise. And then the third area is actually to work with the external environment. So many entrepreneurs such as yourselves that are leading innovations that will be helpful for us internally as we align them and match them with the needs of our businesses and help accelerate that innovation, and recognizing that a lot of the innovative ideas are going to actually come from outside of our organization, and making sure that we can partner appropriately and help drive the innovations that are happening externally with the power and support and scope of our business. With respect to the discussion today, our innovation platform for 2012 is to develop a digital strategy across the enterprise. And the area that we're specifically focused on is within our commercial business. So how can we better utilize digital technologies and information that's derived from digital technologies to help support our commercial model, to help engage patients, and to help us reach underserved markets. Thank you.
So by means of kind of introducing myself, I started my career at Columbia Presbyterian. I was actually doing basic research, and it was because of frustration that myself and other people in our department had with the systems that we had at the university to run clinical trials, as well as a sense of frustration and, to be perfectly candid, helplessness that we felt when we were trying to interact with the systems that we were getting from what we would call the sponsor community. These are life sciences companies as defined as big pharma, biotechs, medical device. Said, well, we think there's an opportunity to use some technology here to jump curves, treat things differently than they did before. There's been a lot of, I think, effort in pharma, certainly in every business vertical out there, to do something right? What would be e-business? We wound up getting into something called electronic data capture, EDC. The real trick for us was to not provide the E, not worry about the E, just trust the fact that the E is going to be everywhere in the world. It's probably in everybody's pocket in this room right now, and it wasn't in 1999, but we all, I think, knew that was going to happen, and said, well, what can we do to kind of change business process on top of it? I'm going to start with a thesis and have my fellow panelists kind of comment on it. I don't think, actually, if you look at what we've done in life sciences, we've done a particularly good job of leveraging E or advancing our processes. I think, actually, the fact that Wendy's job exists is a testament to the fact that we've absorbed that as an industry and we're trying to fix it. My world, as I said, is very much, you get the dark corner of life sciences and in healthcare, and in that is an even darker corner of clinical development, getting a drug that's come out of the lab approved by regulatory agencies. So again, my world is kind of limited to that. But if we look around us, Medidata probably does something on the order of 40, maybe 40+% of all the online transactions related to that process. What we see is big pharma, baby biotech, medical device companies, as a rule, doing a pretty bad job of that. They're really inefficient. We waste a lot of time. We waste a lot of money. People are very focused on cost savings, but not really focused as much as they could be on revenue acceleration, actually getting the right drug to market, et cetera. And it's easy to say this if you're a technology company, but we see the kinds of initiatives where people are saying there is an opportunity to introduce technology to create in a disruptive way, new business process around development as a big, valuable thing. You're seeing the leading executives, at least we do, in the development part of pharma R&D. My other people on the stage are the experts on research and commercial. But I think that really defines the opportunity that's in front of us. It's not easy to be a life sciences company right now, regardless of your size. And when things are hard, when an environment is bad, that creates a huge amount of opportunity for people who can figure out how to take advantage of it. And again, just to kind of wrap it up in a financial bow, if you look at the spending on the part of life sciences that at least we deal with on a day-to-day basis, over the last 10 years, it's gone way up. Productivity, actually generating revenue on new compounds that you did R&D on in the last decade, has gone down to the order of magnitude of something like 70%. It's really an abysmal number. So if we're that fulcrum for healthcare, right, helping people pivot around different value equations for ultimately patients, that's something that we think is a huge opportunity that we can fix. You guys' thoughts? Well, we start with you, Wendy. Your job is innovation.
Yes. So I think you raised some really good points around the inefficiencies around clinical research, and I think we've recognized that also from a standpoint, from a strategy in terms of our investment in research. I think if you look a few years ago, it was, the more you put in, hopefully the more you will get out, and it took us a few years to recognize that we were continuously putting more in, but there wasn't any more coming out. And so as a strategy, we've kind of stepped back and said it's really important for us to fix what's wrong with clinical research and better utilize data and information to help do that before we start plowing more in. So kind of fix the engine and then you put the fuel in. And so from a standpoint of utilizing technology, we've done some assessments around where are the points of pain in clinical trial development, the challenge of getting patients, the challenge of having global investigators all on the same page, understanding the protocol, effectively executing the protocol. And we've looked to ways in which, I think part of the challenge is that we've thought about our business in very siloed ways. So as we've thought about clinical research, we've thought about it just from the standpoint of, well, we need to find patients that are potential for these trials, but we haven't tapped into the other sources and communication points that we have with those potential pools of patients. So as an example, one of the things that we're looking at now is how can we better leverage social media and our presence out in the social media environment as a way to provide more information and connections to potential patients that could be appropriate for clinical trials, and using the geonavigation technology in understanding where people are, that we could appropriately link them up with potential investigators that would be within their geography. Also from an investigator standpoint, how can we better standardize and align information that needs to be collected, or even training on a clinical protocol, so that we can make sure that the physicians can most effectively manage and execute the protocol. So those are just some of the areas that we've looked at and ways that we can kind of cross the divide, so reaching out beyond the research spectrum and looking at how we're using technology in other aspects of our business that would potentially help us connect with investigators, help us connect with patients, and thereby making the research process more efficient. We're not there yet, and we've actually, last year, we also instituted a program where we're working with strategic partners, so we've essentially outsourced all of our clinical development, but we're working very closely with those two CRO organizations in partnership to develop a lot of these processes.
So let's hold the outsourcing thought for 1 second. And I think your comment about the siloed nature of our business is very interesting, right? So I think more often than not, you see a very kind of dogmatic view of what different parts of a life sciences company's organization are supposed to do, and sometimes that's been a barrier for people adopting technology and getting real benefit from it. So what we're talking about in terms of that kind of transition between development and commercial is really interesting. I'm curious from Matt's perspective how that commercial space now is changing given some of the technology introductions, and what's the continuum that comes out of what Wendy was talking about?
Yeah, so what we do is we basically help pharma companies deliver the right message to the right physician at the right time. And for the last 15 years, that has meant giving the sales rep something to do, giving them a tool that they can stay in compliance, and giving them instruction on where they should be targeting their time. As early as 1998, there were slides about multi-channel selling in pharma. And I remember those slides from Siebel. And it was email and phone and internet and web and face-to-face. And there were basically, I don't know, there were 1,000 pilots in the last 15 years. And very few companies really institutionalize this in such a way that they actually have a 360-degree view of the customer. And the way that I would characterize why didn't that happen, because it happened in every other industry. If you want to get insurance, you call Click or Visit. You want to use a bank, you call Click or Visit. You want to buy a car, you call Click or Visit. You want to get information from a pharma company, if you're a doctor, you wait for the rep to come into your office in between patients when you got 15 people waiting. And then you give them 12 seconds. So why didn't it happen in pharma? Well, it didn't happen in pharma because it didn't have to. It's really hard to do this. And if you're a VP of sales, and I've had this discussion, I had this discussion not 5 years ago. Again, I used to have it all the time. You have $1 million that you want to spend. I could hire 10 more sales reps, or I could do this newfangled portal, blah, 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 and we don't really know if that's going to work. If I hire 10 more sales reps, my sales are going to go up. If I do this portal thing, what the hell is going to happen? So they didn't do the portals, or they didn't do $1 million portal, they did 25,000 in a corner down by the clinical trial guys, right in that dark corner that you guys live in. Basically, that is a very difficult transition. I mean, you look at what retailers had to go through and what banks had to go through and what car dealerships have been through. Well, those guys weren't making as much money. And until very recently, the pharma companies were still making tons of money. They're still making tons, just a little bit less. Right? So, I mean, what feels bad for a pharma company, International Paper would go crazy over margins like that, right? They would do cartwheels in the street. But for pharma that's not used to that, they're used to being able to do things in a certain way. The last 36 months have been traumatic for the industry. And I think we've had a pretty upfront seat to seeing some of that change. So it feels like I've been talking a long time. You see that big clock counting down. So what we see, though, is that pharma now has to do it. They have to enable these other channels in such a way that it makes sense from the physician's perspective and from the company's perspective. They are forced, because of access issues and this lack of profitability or change in profitability, and just an expectation on behalf of physicians that they should be able to call, click, or visit if they want to get drug information. The pharma industry has to do this. And most of the big pharmas, most of the top 20 pharmas have spent, I mean, from what I can tell, $5 to $10 million on IT systems in the last 24 months to try to enable these alternative digital channels. And I've spoken to almost all of these companies in the last 6 months, and exactly 0 of them are satisfied with where they are. And so there's still a lot of work in terms of combining digital touch points with face-to-face touch points. And there are very few pharma companies that actually have in one place all of the customer interactions they have against a single customer across all these different channels in one place. Very few companies have that. And that is required for figuring out which was the right touch point, what's the right channel, and getting that mix right so you can do it both from the physician's perspective and from a cost perspective from pharma.
Yeah, Geoff sees the whole environment, so yeah.
Well, I just think there's something to this around the timing, right? I don't remember exactly the tagline for this in the booklet, but it's almost like, did we miss the boat, right? Is it too late? Has pharma already fixed all of its IT problems? No. I mean, not remotely, right? And so I think now there is sort of this perfect storm, which we've been saying pharma's in a perfect storm for 15 years, but of patent expirations, significant patent expirations, right? This idea that, okay, we've given the model of those with the most scientists and most sales reps will win a shot, and it's not true, right? And one of the interesting things about pharma, especially in R&D, is it takes 10 to 15 years to find out if the decision you made played out. Right? And so, but now there is a significant refresh. And the third thing, which I think maybe is the most important in this space around sort of data aggregation and data sharing and more external collaboration, is that I think the regulators and the governments have shifted from this is a problem and we're going to beat down the costs of pills and of healthcare, et cetera, to this is a problem we need to help the industry solve. And so I've never seen, you know, folks we meet with at MHRA or FDA, et cetera, as interested in helping to think creatively around ways to change the process, not just automate the process or tweak the process, but fundamentally change the process to bring the cost down. So if I was creative and entrepreneurial enough to change what I'm doing and get into sort of technology companies serving this business, or folks who can help these companies sort of keep the lights on and do their core things better and faster and cheaper so they can focus on what's next, I think now's the perfect time to do that.
We got some advice this morning about making sure you know who your customer is and approaching the right person. I think if you look at the Pharma Sales, right, we've focused a lot on the provider. Clearly the payer has become an incredibly important person. We've got the patient, who everybody's now starting to put in the center of their own kind of healthcare picture. I found it really interesting to hear about the kind of opinions of pharmacists and how they could take a bigger role in terms of shaping the healthcare paths of patients. You guys have thoughts on that? Maybe starting with Wendy again.
Yeah, so we have included the pharmacist. I think it varies depending on the markets, particularly outside of the U.S. I think we've been thinking for a longer period of time that the pharmacist is playing a very big role, because there we have, in many markets, you might not have the patent protection, and there's a lot more with kind of branded drugs versus not branded, and the influence of the pharmacy in driving a lot of that. But we are recognizing kind of the alternative care sites and how the pharmacy is playing a bigger role in being a location of drug decision making, as well as a key communicator with the consumer, because that's a point. 30% of prescriptions that are written are never filled. And depending on the drug, there's a very high switch rate potentially at the pharmacy. And so that conversation between the pharmacist and the patient is a critically important one, both in terms of getting the patient comfortable with the product that the physician may have written, or the decision to ultimately even take the prescription that they might pick up and pay for. We also find that the number one question into our call center across all of our drugs is, what is this drug for? So many people are getting prescriptions, they're having an interaction with a physician, and due to the time constraints and the amount of and level of depth of conversation that they're able to have with the provider, they actually get diagnosed and treated with something without even understanding what that is. And so the pharmacist can also play a very big important role in filling that gap as well. And so as we look across, I think we talked about the silo compartmentalization of the business before, and the challenge that we've had in developing the IT solutions around that. We also look at kind of the integration across the customers, and how do we, as pharma, we're also looking at how technology can help in the interplay in some of our customers where we're not actually even involved in the conversation. So it's just...
You have any thoughts about that, Geoff?
Mostly as a consumer, right? I mean, I'll acknowledge it isn't an area that I'd focused on much until I heard it this morning. And but as a consumer of those services, I did always sort of ponder, like, these are highly skilled people essentially counting pills, right? Why aren't they dispersing more information? Why aren't they a broader, more important part of the healthcare ecosystem? So I found it interesting, and I took a bunch of notes. but sort of need to ponder it more, I think.
I think as much as the insurers and the life sciences people are hated, right? The pharmacists are kind of going off the charts in terms of trust from consumers.
Yeah, absolutely.
So there's lots of Matt's business other than the customer relationship management as pertains to physicians, but with that part of kind of the Veeva perspective, I mean, what do you think about the...
Well, let me take one of the things that Geoff said. You see the regulatory bodies really trying to partner with the industry. I assume that's on the R&D and clinical side, because I don't see that at all. I think that on the marketing and sales side, the regulators are crippling the industry. I think that they're taking this bad reputation that the industry has, and they're turning it into off-label fines in the billions of dollars. I mean, this is a fundraiser for the industry, and you have pharma sales reps walking around terrified of what they say now. You know, they will not go off the script, someone's looking over my shoulder, and in fact, they're right. There's people looking over their shoulder waiting to get a 10-digit fine out of behavior that, is it bad behavior? Yeah, maybe it's bad behavior, it's against the rules, but is it in the best interest of patients? Very often it is. So I see the regulators in the U.S. not helping with this, and a pharma company's ability to go in to a pharmacy in the U.S. and talk to the pharmacist is crippled because it is not a free-flowing conversation. So pharma is trying in the U.S. to have this dialogue with payers and to try to get on the same side of the table and do real account-based selling, they call it, or key account management. But it's hard for them because there's so many constraints. Now, from a kind of a systems perspective, from the pharmaceutical SFA software, if you looked at the software in 1995 and you looked at the software in 2005, it did the same basic stuff. It started to change a little bit in the last few years, but something that we added into the product last year was order management, so that reps could go in and take orders from pharmacies. They didn't do this 5 years ago. They didn't do this 3 years ago, and it's not in the U.S., by the way. This is in Spain and Italy and Australia. In fact, Pfizer uses our system in Australia to do this. And so we do see, outside of the U.S., a much bigger focus on the pharmacist. We have a lot of conversations around that, but I think in the U.S., the regulators have just crippled the industry.
So we haven't formally declared question and answer time, but full disclosure, Ed Goodman was the first chairman of the board of Medidata Solutions, so I have a very hard time saying no to him. It's physically ingrained into my whole soul. So he put his hand up and he's got a microphone. Ed?
Examples are helpful, so I just wondered if you give an example of a rep constrained by the kind of regulation you talk about, where he might actually have unintended consequences that are negative for patient care.
Yeah, so reps have always had to stay to the label, right? So the package insert of what the FDA exactly approved the drug to do is all that the rep is allowed to talk about. And there's gray areas around the label, all around the label, that could help a physician to think, to connect the dots. Well, it works this way with this mechanism of action. Is there a way it might work with someone like this? Well, if the physician asks that question today, the rep basically has to walk out of the room. It's like, no, hey, I'm out of here. That is not on the label. I'm out. And here, you can sign this and someone will get back to you. It's not like a human response, right? Could we trust these people to be adults and to say, it's an interesting question, doc. You can't say that. That's a big fine. It's an interesting question. You should really talk to someone on our MSL team, and I'd love to kind of broker that conversation, bring someone up on an iPad. Well, the rep has to leave the room now if you do that. Is this artificial? Is it inhumane? Is it uncomfortable? It just seems heavy-handed.
This is, an actual area of technology investment we see not just on the pharma side, but in academic medical institutions. And if you look at the things that the NCI and NIH are trying to do, how can we enable people to really do the kind of translational therapies and do the right research to support what ultimately should be additional labeling claims in a way that scales? And people are having a hard time doing it. I will defend the regulators as a group. I mean, people don't like us in the pharma industry because they have certain opinions about us, but I think most people in our industry are people who care about extending and saving lives, and it's mostly good people. People don't like New Yorkers. They think we're really mean. We're not mean. We're just busy. The regulators are in charge of protecting people's lives in a certain way, and they have to do various things to do it. They've done, in some cases, I think, a good job of encouraging people to think differently and use technology differently. But I think this is a very interesting area. I mean, the liability that you have as a pharmaceutical company extends far past the patent life that defines the revenue that you're going to get at any appreciable rate in comparison to the cost of developing that drug. I mean, Wendy?
Yeah, I mean, we paid a very big fine a few years ago to the tune of $2 billion because of inappropriate promotion. And to say that it crippled, I mean, I think everything Matt said, we experience that on a daily basis. I think an interesting element of it that as it gets further developed to see how it changes the conversation is real world analytics. So as more data becomes available, doctors, while they may be limited in the conversations they can have with sales representatives around our drugs, they're free to use the drugs in whatever way they deem most appropriate for the best treatment of their patients. And so there will be data coming out and an analysis that looks at off-label utilization, and I think there'll be questions then posed as to, what does that mean in terms of where the drug can really be used, and if there haven't been clinical studies done by the manufacturer in that area and it's put in the label, the manufacturer is somewhat limited in how and where it can answer those questions. And so I think it's going to change the dynamics of the conversation. It's going to change, we're looking now and asking some really hard questions about where and how we've authorized medical to be a part of the conversation. We have a very big firewall right now, and as Matt discussed, we bring a medical person into the conversation, the rep needs to leave. We cannot have medical conversations at the same time we have promotional conversations. But the questions and the information needs of the providers are changing. So as we talked about ACOs earlier today and the types of responsibilities and thoughtful considerations that providers, the information that they're going to need to have, it's going to change. Quite honestly, what we're facing, a lot of the information that our reps provide today is very easily accessible on the internet. They don't need a representative to provide that information. The information and resources they need are things that our representatives can't say.
So another interesting thing that I think comes out of some of the conversations this morning is who's really responsible for the patient's well-being, right? So we heard some conversations about how the pharmacist is becoming more prominent in that role, the patient themselves, even though they don't have the medical degree, need to take it on. We used to look at the providers to do that. What's the role of the payers in trying to think through that? And is there a role for pharma as trying to take more responsibility for the patient's ultimate outcomes? And is that a way to try to break some of the molds that we've got wrapped around our heads?
Well, we're certainly seeing pharma having aspirations in that space, if for no other reason than what we're seeing happen to the revenue of traditional pill models, right? And so getting into services and managing patient care, sort of from cradle to grave is certainly an aspiration. I actually think it's an and, right? And because of some of these regulations, I think there's a lot of power in this data. We heard this morning, and I firmly agree, you got to sort of free the information, right? People who are sort of business model is around hoarding data probably isn't the way to go. But the more data there is, I don't think we'll ever get to the place where pharma is going to be the only one interpreting that data. So let's partner with payers and providers or academic institutions to better interpret and then get the message out more broadly. Right.
But it's tied with the reputation of the industry.
Yeah,
Could
absolutely.
the industry do it? Yes. Should the industry do it? Yes. Are there people in the industry that care more about patients than in maybe any other industry? Absolutely yes. But we don't trust them to do it anymore. I remember when, I don't know if it's Business Week or Forbes or whoever does the most respected and the least respected industries. Pharma used to be number one. I remember when it was actually the first year it was below the cigarette companies. And it's saddening, really, because it's so bad now. The reputation is so bad that pharma can't do like a feel-good advertising campaign. Put patients on television talking about how they got better and their life was saved because of a pharmaceutical drug they're taking. The reputation's so bad that they can't even do that. And that, to me, is saddening, because this industry does a lot of good, and I think that there's a lot of politics and regulation tied up in this bad reputation. And it's also, pharma is an easy target. When you talk about the total cost of healthcare, pharma is the easiest one to measure. It's so easy to measure. And if you're running a big company and you got to cut 5% of your cost, where do you go? Well, that one, I know exactly what that costs. Let's cut that one, because everything else is kind of cloudy. It's the easiest one to measure. It is an easy target, but it's not that big of a percentage of the overall healthcare spend. And it's certainly not the thing that is driving healthcare costs upward. In fact, I think that not allowing the industry to act more as a free market industry or a player in this industry, I think actually maybe is reducing costs. Excuse me, that was bad. Is increasing cost over time.
I think
So go ahead.
no, I just wanted to add another part to that. So I think a lot of it from a pharmaceutical standpoint is the fact that we haven't made the value case. So we've thought about just selling a pill, and that when you have the dynamics where patients who don't know what disease they have and what they're being prescribed, and you get to the pharmacy and you're told that it's going to cost $120 for your prescription, they don't understand there's no value in that. And so that's where it gets, I think, to the services, and why now it's a slightly different paradigm where you need to provide greater value. It needs to be about treatment of that condition and all the things that go with it, the pill being a component of it. And so I think that's where, if we can get to a place, and granted we're nowhere near there today, but if we can get to a place where we're viewed as more of a health solutions company versus a pill company, because the pill can be commoditized, and when you go and you find out that Lipitor is $75, but you can get generic simvastatin for $4, but you have zero appreciation for whether or not they're even the same drug, then it seems like a no-brainer that you would go for the $4 one, and the awful, terrible pharmaceutical company that would try to rip you off by even suggesting that maybe the $75 one would be a better option for you. There needs to be a lot more transparency about the information and the differences. Matt's point is a mantra that we speak of often internally, which is the right drug for the right patient at the right time. But there's a lot more information and kind of ancillary components that go with the drug in order to get people to appreciate that.
So it's interesting. We do a lot of stuff to help people write protocols, right? So designing the experiment that you do on people to show traditionally safety and efficacy. But now, if you talk to the head of research and development at a life sciences company, they're starting to talk about endpoints not just in safety and efficacy, but in value. Right? So can we figure out what the right patient is, what the right time is, and this is going to be something that's going to have a certain cost to manufacture, a certain cost to market, a certain cost to deliver, a certain level of pain or discomfort for the patient that ultimately is going to equate in this being a good thing to bring to market. And just to go back to the technology opportunity for a sec, I mean, I think what Matt's highlighting is this spectacular opportunity for pharmas to behave differently by looking at a broader data set with a lot more inputs. We may not all be living in the age of electronic health records, but we're definitely all, just by being alive today, in the age of it being completely feasible to scan your entire genetic makeup and have your full genome available for your treatment. It's going to be, you could do it today. Everybody in this room, I bet, can afford it today. But everybody's going to have that at some point very shortly. What's pharma going to do with that? There's a huge amount of data that could be coming out of the providers, coming out of payers to look at what the right indications are. I mean, are we sitting on an opportunity for the right big data thinking, for the people who can connect the right dots in this kind of information infrastructure in all of healthcare, so the pharma's poised to take advantage of it will have significant competitive advantage?
Yeah, I mean, we certainly think we are, although I don't think Matt's point about reputation is an easy one. So before we leave that, and I'm a consultant to the pharmaceutical industry, so I don't even know if Forbes' list goes that low, right? So I'd love to see the reputation turned around, but it's not going to happen overnight. So given that, I think that in and of itself is an opportunity for the people in this room, right? Because someone has to be the concierge or the aggregator or the middle person to bring some of these things to market, right? And then I think the same kind of goes for the data, right? Yes, there's tremendous potential in better understanding the data, aggregating the data, pulling in not just Pfizer's data, but publicly available data and data that payers have, data that providers have, et cetera. But I think it's going to be a consortium across the healthcare ecosystem, if you will, that's going to get that done. Not pharma, or not Pfizer in a dark corner, or Lilly in Indianapolis, right?
Sorry, we got another question over here. If we could just get the microphone over. While it's coming over, I'll just mention a phrase I think is really interesting that I didn't hear about 10 years ago in pharma, and that's the phrase pre-competitive. Right? And a lot of people in the pharma industry are trying to figure out how we can all share data to answer some of those questions better before you actually have gotten to the point of trying to sell your drug in the marketplace. And I think that'll be an interesting dynamic. Sorry, go ahead.
So yeah, in addition to the kind of siloed nature of the way organizations work that you referred to, and in addition to the clearly formidable regulatory burdens that we have, in my observations working with the industry, it seems like there's another factor here that's also in play that I think might even be more difficult to overcome. I was just wondering if you could comment on it, and that is there seems to be a cultural reluctance to innovate within these organizations that seems to be part and parcel of the fact that they have been regulated for so long and they've been basically conditioned not to make mistakes. And the lawsuits are just the most egregious example of that. But so how do you take a company that is trying to really be innovative and has vice presidents of innovation on their payroll and say, how do we get them to actually understand risk-taking is something that we don't only allow, but we actually actively encourage, and mistakes are okay, because this is a culture generally that is against making mistakes. So I was just curious whether or not that's something you've had thoughts about.
Yeah, it's a huge challenge. I mean, I would say that that's probably the biggest obstacle that I face as the head of innovation is getting people to think about what it really takes to have more of those transformative, disruptive innovations, and actually to fund them as well, because they're not, we are on the commercial side more short-sighted in opportunity, and as you're characterizing, also more resistant to risk and taking some of those challenges. And it's interesting because I was speaking to a colleague right before this session about the kind of dichotomy between the culture in research versus the culture in the commercial side, because taking risk and accepting failure is part of developing drugs. I mean, that's why it actually costs so much to develop drugs, because you have to screen thousands of potential candidates before you are able to develop the few compounds that you could potentially take to market. And within our within our clinical organization, the concept of failing fast, being able to make those decisions quickly and move on to other things that have more potential is really kind of the core of the culture there. But it's not in the commercial organization. And so we're really trying to identify where some of the opportunities are that exist and trying to kind of demonstrate the value of innovation as an opportunity to try to spread and kind of inculcate the culture that's required in order to do that. But it is very hard to kind of steer the oil tanker. And so, so we are trying with more specific opportunities. And I think we have some examples in our organization. We use a digital selling platform for our representatives, which was a huge step forward when we introduced it. But the enthusiasm kind of petered out. We weren't really good at kind of keeping the excitement and the momentum going to further the development and really make the most out of that innovation. So I think we still have a lot of work ahead of us, and it really is a very huge obstacle. So if you have any ideas or suggestions.
I just need to make a comment about that. I think this is actually a key technology opportunity. There is this kind of inherent lack of desire to innovate in the pharma industry for sure, but look at what Wendy's doing. She's looking at technologies that she can use to create an environment that forces Pfizer employees to innovate. Look at what Matt and I are doing. We're creating technologies that allow people to break down some of those silos, that kind of put it in their face in ways that they hadn't before. Right? Look at what Geoff does. He tries to do the organizational change management to get them there. So I think that it's a very ripe, target-rich environment because these executives who weren't worried about stuff like this 10 years ago are now going, wow, I really have to figure out how to accelerate revenue.
But I'm seeing some contradictions there in my experience. I was at a meeting last year in Europe, actually, and at that, the chairman gave a speech about innovation as being the lifeblood of this very large pharmaceutical company. And the very next day, I had a meeting with a brand director who said, we were talking about ideas they could do in social media and other things, and he said, I'm not going to try anything like that. The last guy who tried that got fired. Right. So if the behavior at the CEO level is to say one thing but not to reinforce it with both budget and reward, even for making mistakes, as you have on the scientific side, it's never going to change. So is there the will at the executive suite level to actually do what you need to do to get that change inside the culture?
Yeah,
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I think you're right. I do think it actually, cultural change does very much start at the top. And I think we've seen more and more big pharma in particular, and especially on the R&D side, realize that scale isn't necessarily better in science, right? And bureaucracy and admin is far too constraining. And so I think, what Ian Reed's done at Pfizer, I think is really inspiring. That is a giant ship, and it's going to take him time. But someone who's come up through the pharmaceutical system, right, and I believe he has a science background as well, right, kind of understands that, and so they're partnering, creating these pods where they partner and co-locate with academic institutions and hospitals. I think that is going to be much more innovative. Now, again, 10 to 15 years from now, we'll find out if that strategy was really successful, right, because it takes a long time to get completely through the development curve, but I think that's one example. I think what GSK has been doing over the last few years with Andrew Whitty, I think the way they're thinking about science is very different, very innovative. But you're still going to have those people in the middle who, until they sort of see success come out of that and personal benefit come out of that for other people, there's going to be inertia. Right?
But you won't know for 10 to 15 years.
If I could just add to that question, I mean, there are, to what you were saying, there are other businesses that have gone through this transition. I mean, I now develop mobile health apps, and I was formerly head of digital business for Sony. And I'm having the same conversations that I had over 10 years ago. And it just seems odd that it's almost like you have all of this history of these other businesses, yet it doesn't get incorporated at all, other than at the very most senior level, which isn't really how these businesses scale. It's about enabling lots of little companies access, monitored access, but access. And so programs like, tools for people that want to develop, those don't seem to be happening at all. It's like every conversation has to happen at the most senior level, which means calling in lots of favors, and everything takes so much time.
But the change really is, I really believe, happening right now. And if you, I'll give you guys a little piece of controversy for the cloud section later. I know a lot of people use it. I don't think the private cloud is a thing. Right? I think that's called a data center. Right? So what is happening in cloud and in life sciences? Well, the FDA, right? The CIO of the FDA was just talking about using cloud computing, literally things like Amazon Web Services, to do certain kinds of data storage. People are going to be looking more and more to companies like Veeva, who are providing what in effect is a public cloud, multi-tenant environments for life sciences data to do things. The CIO and CFO of Roche, right, just announced that they're going to move their entire corporate communications infrastructure to Gmail. Right, so yes, this is still corner office or maybe top floor offices, but I do think that we're seeing this trend of it starting to trickle down. And again, that's the target-rich environment where, at least from an entrepreneurial perspective or building service offerings around new technologies, this is a really good time to work with pharma.
Yeah, I mean, a specific example right along this. Well, first of all, private cloud is something. It's fiction. So it is something. That one bugs me, I guess, as much as it bugs you.
Sorry, Walgreens, dude. Where are you?
No, a corporation can have their own private cloud, but a company like us cannot. It's like, anyway. We have a content management platform that stores documents that go into R&D and clinical trials and promotion materials. I'm not selling something, but there's a specific thing here. We had backups. So we have our own production data center, we have our own backup data center, and then we had like 45 copies, like super duper backups. You could never ever lose anything at Amazon. Okay, and we were audited over and over by pharma companies who would always kind of, the Amazon thing, can you tell me about the Amazon thing again? We say, yeah, it's really, really cheap, and you'll never lose any data. So fast forward 6 months, we get ready to close in our first big deal with a top 20 pharma, and they said, you got to get rid of the Amazon. And they said, well, then we're going to have to charge you more. And they said, yeah, that's okay, but we don't want any Amazon. So there's public cloud, there's regulated public cloud maybe, and I think that there are limits to innovation in a regulated industry. These guys can't take any risk. And so in an environment where you're not allowed to take any risk, how do you take risk in innovation? And it's why I don't work at a pharma company, because I don't like constraints. And I think it's Bill, your question is right on. How do you innovate in a highly regulated industry that's walking on ice?
How do you do it, Wendy?
Right. Well, I mean, I think some of it is just. I think some of it is identifying what the barriers are. So there are areas where we can take risks and things that we can do. And I also think there's, we've been going back and forth a lot in the social media arena because of the challenges of having open dialogue with consumers. And part of what we're just asking ourselves is, how do we make ourselves more comfortable with the risk? So it's not to say that the risk goes away. The regulators have still, been unclear as to what the final regulations are, as to what we're responsible for and what we're not responsible for. But we can't ignore some of the developments in these spaces and the way that people are choosing to communicate with one another. And quite honestly, if people share incorrect information about one of our drugs in a social media setting, it's there whether we're participating in that discussion or not. And so I think we have to think about what are some of the restrictions that are true brick walls and that prevent us from going forward, and what are other areas that we just have to be more comfortable.
And some of it goes back to the pre-competitive comment you made earlier too. I think there's, I get in trouble for saying this on video, I think there's safety in numbers, and so I think we're facilitating some interesting pre-competitive discussions where the industry is realizing some of these things need to be worked through. The regulatory agencies are there as well. And I think, one company on their own out on a very long limb is dangerous. 6 or 8 or 10, the limb's bound to break, but you're all gonna go together, right? And I think again, back to, I'm frustrated you're not seeing it on the commercial side, but I do think on the R&D side, we are seeing regulators more open to helping be a part of the solution, not just magnifying the problem, and give it 10 years of perfect storm, and they'll get there on the marketing and sales side as well, maybe.
Again, if people have more questions for us, obviously we've broken that ice, but at any time, just stick up your hand.
One in the corner.
Actually, there's one right there, right next to the microphone.
I think a question for Wendy. Could you get us up to speed? What happened last year with the FDA and the digital advertising, because that with pharma companies, and what the glitch was as far as companies like WebMD and different companies where Hippocrates, WebMD, where their budgets for pharma advertising, I guess, dried up, and they were saying there was an FDA letter that was out there. It was kind of a boogeyman out there where.
Oh, okay.
So can you get us up to speed on where that is, what happened with that, and where it is today? Do you have any information on that?
I'm not as close to that particular situation, but I think it's I guess the comment was that it was related to the user-generated content. So we're really looking at what we can say and where that information can go. And so while we have looked internally, we recognize part of the challenge from a technology standpoint has been we can build and control our own environment. So developing a Pfizer web page, product web pages, we have direct control over the information that's there. But what we find is that it's less useful and relevant to a lot of our customers. So it's one of the challenges that we're kind of retrenched internally and trying to work through and figure out how can we get our information and the appropriate level and scope of information in some of the locations that our customers are going to look for information. So WebMD, Hippocrates, we're doing some evaluations right now with EMR systems and looking at what type of information can be incorporated, because we recognize that being in the provider's workflow and providing the information that is of value to them in a place where they're going to look for it is the ideal. But we have constraints over what can be communicated and the level of communication that can occur.
Oh, that's the microphone.
But wrapped up in that one, pharma can't tell you something about a drug without fair balance in telling you the risks. And so if you have a Google ad for a drug, if it says anything more than just the name of the drug, if it just has the name and what it's for, then you need all that fair balance stuff. It's like the TV commercials. This drug will take away all of your allergy symptoms, but it causes headaches, vomiting, backaches, elbow aches, nausea, and all that stuff as fast as they can. You can't do that in a Google ad. You can't do that in 132 characters in Twitter. You can't do it in all these different places. I think what you were referring to was the FDA said if you can't do the fair balance, you can't do it. And that cut a lot of the advertising because they had to have a way to show all of the potential side effects at the same time they were talking about the drug.
But we actually have been able to work with a lot of the advertisers to do that. So, and as well as work with the regulators as to what's acceptable and how much information can be accessible. So as long as you have a point where you can click and it's clear where you can go for the fair balance information, there seems to be more acceptability of that as a solution. So we're working across with many of the internet providers in order to come up with acceptable solutions so that relevant information is available and easily accessible.
Would you say the FDA is helping? So to our little
guidance, right?
Yeah. So they've been
because they've been really slow.
They have been, and they've been unclear, and so they've walked. So we're right now on the there's some people, there's some in the camp of just wait till let's not do anything because if they decide and it's counter to what we do, then we have to undo everything. And there are others that are saying, you know what, the fact that they haven't decided, let's get in there. To your point, form a coalition and help shape what they're going to do. And so it's still kind of in flux.
So is Mitch Rothschild in the house? I saw you earlier, and I don't now. This is a perfect time to assign a question to someone in a seat. Let me take a quick stab at the question that just got asked because this is something that Vitals.com has grappled with because it hit their revenue, and it speaks directly to some of Matt's comments about sort of the toxicity, if you will, of the regulatory environment. I think the issue that the questioner was referring to is that pharma legal counsel concluded that if they were doing banner ads on social network sites where there was user-generated content, in other words, unknown people logging on and saying, I took Claritin and developed hives, that constituted an adverse event that the drug company was obliged to research. Mm-hmm. And it was a sort of massive, open-ended liability that sort of slashed, a major interaction between the drug companies. I think that's what was going on there.
Yeah, and related to the sort of what Facebook stopped allowing you to sort of block open posts, right? And so pharma quickly ran away because somebody gets out there and says, I love chapstick so much I can't stop, I'm addicted, right? Like, wow, now you have an addiction report to chapstick.
We actually don't have to report that.
You don't have to report that one?
Not to chapstick.
I'll talk to you later because one of your colleagues. Never mind. But I think it's all wrapped up in the same answer. I think it was a statement that was made. Pharma generally scurried away from it, and now is coming back. And even the FDA has issued some initial guidance and at least said that they're interested in exploring this topic more. And we can't say the internet's going to go away or that Facebook's going to go away, right? We got to find ways to embrace it and do it in a controlled and reasonable kind of way.
I'd go beyond that, not just control it, but take advantage of it, right? The pharmaceutical companies of the future will have figured out how to make that a competitive advantage. We've got 2 minutes, 30 seconds each on the future of innovation and technology in pharma, starting with Wendy.
I think there's a lot of opportunity. I think the big challenge for us is really how we harness the information. 90% of the information that's generated doesn't get used. So there's a wealth of information about our customers and about our products that if we can figure out how to harness it to help meet the customer's needs, there's a lot of potential value there.
Geoff?
Yeah, I'll go back to my opening comment, right? I think these folks, R&D, IT professionals in general, are struggling with the fact that they spend way too much of their time, energy, and money keeping the lights on. So there's opportunity for folks in outsourcing, in software as a service, and just anything that can be wrapped as a service and delivered to them in a cost-effective way with a high level of quality that will allow them and their talent to focus on what's next. Right?
So in my completely unbiased view, I think that there's a lot of benefit of some of the new technology. And in all seriousness, I've seen it. I mean, I've seen companies save millions of dollars while increasing their capabilities by moving to a more modern technology platform. And there was some discussion about big data and how getting pre-competitive data across the industry can yield new insights. The technologies that are now available to manage huge amounts of data are, I think, way beyond Moore's Law that much better than what we had 5 and 10 years ago. And so I think that there will be a lot of new companies started in that area to really try to take advantage of the public platforms that are out there to store and manage and crunch all that data, and then we'll get the big brain consultants in to really make sense of it. But I think that there's really a lot of potential. The thing that I worry about is the reputation. I continually worry about that, and I think that it has handcuffs on the industry in many areas.
Yeah, I'd see those handcuffs as an opportunity. There's somebody in the room who referred to at least Medidata Solutions as a furry little mammal running around eating the flesh off the dead dinosaurs' bones of our industry. From a technology perspective, I think there's a lot of evolution to go, and it's going to come from the technology side. Thank you, everybody, for your time.
That's great.